space settlement prototype 30 years ahead of its time. So welcome, Greg.
Okay, well, thank you. I assume the sound is coming through.
Yes, yes, we can see your slides.
Great. So I'll start right off with, well, what is a biosphere? Basic definition is all the ecosystems that are inside of an enclosed volume. And enclosed really means closed materially. That is, no material going in or out, or at least close to it. So for instance, Earth certainly fits that category because, yeah, a little bit of material does escape from the upper atmosphere and, a few meteorites come in. But for the most part, on average, out to very high number of significant digits, is essentially enclosed. On the other hand, it is open for energy. So of course we receive solar energy. That's not a problem. Or information, we can send signals back and forth. That doesn't violate the notion of enclosed volume. It's really just closed materially. It includes the atmosphere, the seas, even geological processes. One key feature in general is that they are sustainable, pretty much self-regulating, given just the energy input, meaning in our case, energy from the sun. So there's 3 examples of biospheres shown down here. One, of course, is Earth, which is also called Biosphere 1 in the terminology of the biosphere people. At the small end, there's novelties that have been produced, really came out of research from the University of Hawaii, but they found that you can seal up inside of a small glass globe a small number of organisms, tiny brine shrimps and algae and microbes and so on. And they will live for some significant period of time, pretty much just given some energy input from the sun. The question is what comes in between, and that, of course, the answer there is Biosphere 2, and that's the one in the middle here. So the question is, how small can you make one and still support a significant number of people? You get down to modeling these things. Well, Earth, which is Biosphere 1, that works. But it's complicated, very hard to model, a lot of species, interactions between them, a lot of closed material cycles. There's flows of water, nutrients, carbon, going back and forth between the atmosphere and the soil and the oceans and so on. Again, it's roughly self-regulating. In particular, noticing with the Earth, the sun is about 25 to 30% brighter than it was at the start of life. So we've come a long way. The biosphere itself, that is, life within this enclosed volume, has survived ice ages, warm periods, meteor impacts. Actually, the most traumatic event was probably when we started doing photosynthesis, when those organisms appeared and oxygen started entering the atmosphere. Huge change. So in general, yeah, individual species arrive, they kind of come and go. 99% of them have been extinct, but the biosphere itself survives. It regulates itself. There's the short-term issue of maintaining temperatures and so on. Longer term issue, of course, evolution has a role as well. Now, anyway, how small of a biosphere could support people? I guess I should answer, well, why should we care? First of all, it comes down to supporting space settlement. Due to the gravity well of Earth, it just costs a heck of a lot to import anything from Earth. And even if you start importing resources from the moon and so on in the future, there's still going to be a significant cost to that. But beyond just the cost, there's also the risk associated with timely resupply. If you have periods of economic or political chaos, you may go decades without any resupply. So there's an obvious advantage to being as independent and autonomous as possible in future space settlements on places like the moon or Mars or beyond. And in the longer run, of course, escaping the solar system, you're talking about really long trips. You pretty much have to take everything you need from Earth with you. So, and I suppose I shouldn't have to say to this group, but space settlement, of course, is important. One reason for that is simply that Earth is temporary. I mean, Biosphere 1 will be boiled away as, in the future, as the sun expands. It's a long time. But of course, we won't actually probably get that far because we have asteroids that could come or, plagues that might be genetically engineered. The way I look at it is quite simple. We're probably maybe a third or even a half of the way through the useful life of the Earth. We better get going on finding out how Earth works well enough so that we can start to reproduce it in other places. And of course, that's what Biosphere 2 is all about. Think of it as an engineering prototype and a research tool for sustainable space settlement. And I'll contrast that, for instance, to something like the space station, which has to be resupplied on a regular basis. Everything has to be carried up from Earth, food, air, all that. Biosphere 2, it happened so long ago, people have almost forgotten about it, but it actually still holds the record as the largest and the longest running closed environmental test that we've had. its enclosed volume was about 7.2 million cubic feet. And just for reference, that's about 220 times the volume of the pressurized volume of the International Space Station. It was sealed up for 2 years, starting in 1991, sealing up 8 people and 3,800 species of plants and animals, and, well, uncountable species of microbes that probably were never identified. It was a big project. It cost around $200 million. The facility is still there. It currently is run by the University of Arizona. They always had a role in it from the very beginning. It's a research lab. It is open to the public. I also add that it is open to the atmosphere. It is no longer a sealed system. So it's not running the kind of experiments that it did back in the 1990s. So anyway, this talk is a retrospective on that experiment, what was behind it and the results. And, you know, my summary would simply be, they were 30 years ahead of the time. We were just simply not ready to even get to the point of thinking about these issues. You know, we didn't have cheap ways to get into space. And now the things are starting to change. It's time to start thinking about these things again. So some details. The building itself covers about 3 acres. Of course, there's a basement, so that of course doubles the amount of space available. At its highest point is about 91 feet. It's in Oracle, Arizona. It has a lot of buildings besides the biosphere itself. There's cooling towers to support it, backup generators, and that sort of thing. And of course, as required, it is closed to material flow. They got the air leakage rate down to about 10% per year, and they did maintain positive pressure in this thing, so that as a result, any leakage that occurred was from the inside to the outside, so preserving the integrity of the experiment. And that took a lot of effort. It was hard to get good sealants for glass. There's a stainless steel liner underneath this thing that weighs 500 tons. So this was actually a pretty substantial project. It was organized essentially, you know, paralleling Earth. You know, you couldn't really be sure exactly what to do, so they decided to throw in as much of Earth as they could. So 5 wilderness biomes: a rainforest, a savanna, marsh, an ocean, and even a desert. And then, of course, there were, you know, there's agriculture, because this thing had to be self-sufficient, so they grow their own food, and a human habitat. And then it had, you know, what they called the technosphere, following the sphere kind of terminology. Basically, it's the basement, but it includes all the technical support, you know, pumps, valves, tanks, that sort of thing. So here's an overview of the whole thing. So the rainforest, the highest part, there's an artificial mountain there in the middle of that. And then that's actually overlooking an ocean. We'll talk a little bit more about the details of these things. But the ocean, there is actually streams. There's streams coming down from here, kind of work their way through the savanna area, which is overlooking the ocean, down around through the marsh area, and then finally down into the ocean. The desert's over here. And then the human habitat is separate. That's a library and observation point up here, but the human part was living in the front. And then there's a big area dedicated to intensive agriculture, and the what are essentially floating roof tanks to maintain the pressure in the system are called lungs. They're over here on the sides. So here's a picture, slightly different view. Here you're focusing on the human habitat part of it. You're looking at the agricultural area here, rainforest here, savanna and ocean over here, and the desert you can't quite see. Taking a little view back, little overview here. Overall site, you can see how it fits in. Here's the main buildings in the center of this. You had some cooling towers, and the backup generators are over here. There was a mission control. They had a mission control facility in this building, various other support buildings where they had the stage keeping of the plants before they were ready to be planted, that sort of thing. And there were labs and all that. And there was a small hotel on site. And then these were added a bit later. They were mostly academic facilities set up during a period when Columbia University was right on the site. What does it look like inside? Well, you can imagine what most of it looks like. The rainforest, this is the upper rainforest. You can't quite see it, but that's the top of the artificial mountain right here. Lower rainforest. This is the ocean. You get a little sense of the scale with there's a rowboat there. The deep part of the ocean here, or coral reef, shallow part of the ocean. The savannas overlooking it, and the marshes over here. A little close-up view on the marsh. It is layered in several areas, so that it starts out with the pretty much fresh water working its way down to salt water, pretty much mimicking the way that estuaries work on the Earth. Just another view looking back from the top of the savanna, overlooking the marsh, the ocean, and the bottom of the rainforest. And this is the desert area, again, looking from the savanna through what they call thorn scrub, sort of almost deserty, but not quite, but then the hardcore desert over there. It's a humid desert, more like Baja California. It had to be because you're in the same atmosphere as the rainforest, so you can't get it that dry. A picture of the inside of the agricultural area. They had, maybe 18 areas dedicated to crops. They also had, some facilities for small animals. So then there's the infrastructure to support all this. It's probably easiest to look at it as kind of like looking like a chemical plant. That plus the base of any building, it had a lot of air conditioning. Obviously, you put something in the middle of the Arizona desert in a greenhouse, and it's going to take a lot of air conditioning. So it had a lot of that as well. But pumps, valves, tanks, they managed the water. Some of that involved storing things in tanks, besides just the small lakes. So they also had installed a CO2 scrubber. And this actually was quite controversial. It was added late in the project. This used chemicals, not the metal oxide that might be familiar to people here that was involved in the space shuttle. It was controversial because it did violate the sustainability spirit. Mainly, the real problem was that it just wasn't explained ahead of time. So it made it look like there was some kind of problem here. It comes down to looking back at it today. It's kind of, you start off, are you trying to really be sustainable, or are you trying to be pragmatist on let's get out there and get into space? Because right now you look at how do we go into space? It's all technosphere. It's all technical. Biology doesn't really play a part other than the barest minimum to provide food and take care of your waste. This project, the vision was to start at the very other extreme, get as close as possible to a sustainable biosphere, something that could last for a long time. And of course, the reality is systems are going to be hybrid for a long time. So other features that did have ponds and streams and waterfalls, that they actually cared about the aesthetics so that the people inside would feel good about walking around. They didn't feel like they were inside of a tin can. Of course, it had monitoring systems, maybe 2,500 sensors. It had online analyzers and some lab analyzers. And the so-called lungs, which are like floating roof tanks, the 16-ton aluminum disc, best actually visualized by looking at the picture. These are taller than a people would be in these supports here. But this thing floats up and down, essentially maintaining a positive pressure inside the rest of the biosphere, connected by a tunnel. This tunnel also was handy for as a jogging track for the people inside. So how would you design such a thing? It's maybe not that obvious. What were the goals? What were the constraints? We'll start with that. So the goals, well, they wanted to demonstrate feasibility. So this was really more of an engineering prototype. It got billed as science early on. And in a way, that was kind of a PR problem for them. I think they should have sold it as more as an engineering prototype. But they basically wanted to show that you could live in complete isolation from the atmosphere of the Earth. They sealed this thing up for 2 years, airtight. So they had to sustain the air, the soil, the water, and all that, and the diet. Now, obviously, you start off with some amount of food. Imagine you had steady state. The question is, can you produce enough food in the amount of area you have to keep on going, indefinitely? Not having a better design model, they just said, well, okay, let's try to do the kinds of things that are involved in Earth. And the advantage of that is, of course, you also get a better understanding of Earth. You're going to do a lot of mathematical modeling of this stuff, tracking of the nutrient cycles and so on. And things like global warming, what is the effect of higher CO2 on the plants and people? What is the effect of doing more recycling? You can see all this in an isolated system that really exists essentially independently of Earth's atmosphere. They also wanted to develop some technology usable in space or on Earth. In particular, recycling technologies. One thing they really were big on was a thing called a soil bed reactor, essentially blowing air through the soil that's growing plants, taking advantage of the microbes that are in the soil, really for removing a lot of toxic elements that might work their way. And that is, and some analogous things were algal scrubbers, that is for algae to remove things from the ocean as well. They also had to develop highly productive agriculture. If you're going to be out in space, you don't want to spend all your time farming. You want to make that as productive as possible. And of course, there's the human factors issue. They wanted to know, could you work in small isolated work groups for 2 years or more? What would happen? So the biggest constraints are simply the closed loop nature of it. That means you have to have food self-sufficiency and atmosphere, recycle and truly reuse all of your water. Some things you probably hadn't thought about is they really couldn't have toxic chemicals there, including pesticides or herbicides. So that changes their agriculture quite a bit. You don't have pesticides in there because they're really toxic to people. And so there's two possibilities. Either you assume the plants are going to kill all the, dissolve all of the pesticides eventually, but then of course, how would you get new ones? It wouldn't be sustainable. So the basic answer is avoid all that. That had implications even in terms of reagents needed for the laboratories and so on. The thing, of course, was tightly sealed, and it had to be designed for at least 2 years in the first closure experiment. They had really designed it to last 100 years. They expected this to be used for experimentation for a long time. And of course, they wanted to test, what's sometimes called the GAIA hypothesis, that the biosphere would be more or less self-regulating, like Earth. And examples of that are things like, and this is, I'm sorry, it doesn't require anything mystical. This is just an emergent property that as species interact. A good example of that is a predator-prey cycle. And a lot of those are pretty well known, where, you have, say you have rabbits and you have lynxes, which eat the rabbits, and the rabbits multiply, and then after a while, more of the lynxes multiply. They eat too many of the rabbits, and so you get a cycle going on where the population varies. It's called a limit cycle in control theory. It's very nonlinear, but it's a very common occurrence actually on Earth. Now, in the Biosphere 2 case, they tried to eliminate this with the larger animals. The main problem being you had such small populations, you couldn't risk extinction. So that really the humans had to act as the keystone predator. There were no lynxes in the Biosphere 2. So there's the whole question of what is system stability? What does that even mean for a biosphere? I think control theory offers a lot of possibilities, a lot of definitions of stability. The one that makes the most sense is essentially a bounded input, bounded output type of stability. That is, you can have cycles as long as they stay within the boundaries, given some level of external disturbances. As long as they don't exceed a certain amount, you can have all the cycling you want, and that's normal. That is how actually Earth operates right now. It is complicated because you have so many species, and every time you add one, it changes the behavior. The case of no predators versus predators is huge, for instance, because what stops the previous prey from just growing and growing and growing, they may collapse due to lack of food or bad weather or disease, as opposed to being kept in check by the lynxes. And the general assumption, and what appears to be true, is that the robustness of the system should improve with more species. So if one species gets in trouble, there's others that are sort of performing similar roles that can jump in and kind of take over. But as I said, it's pretty hard to model all this. So what do you do then? You're never going to know everything. You can't model everything. What do you do? Well, that led to species packing. That's what they called it. Basically, if you don't know exactly what you need, fill a big suitcase, take as many things as you can. In this case, it means take a lot of species and know ahead of time that not all of them are going to survive. The system, it would be expected, however, to organize itself. You will have extinctions. Now, one way to help guarantee success is to make sure you're bringing in actual seawater, actual soil, because you want to ensure that there's adequate microbes there. In a lot of ways, they're the most important species on the planet. I mean, everything, you don't tend to think about them, but their biomass is huge. They perform fundamental roles. The plankton in the ocean, really do most of the photosynthesis, even more than the land. So anyway, they started with 3,800 species. The agriculture, they organized it with crop rotation and that sort of thing. And as I said, they had all kinds of goats. They had hens and pigs, at least. And one that I think that did survive all that was fish were grown in rice paddies. That's a traditional method of growing in places like Vietnam, and that was used there as well. One key feature on the agriculture is it was soil-based, not hydroponic. Everybody always assumes hydroponic, but that actually wasn't considered very sustainable either, because there's typically chemicals that are needed for the fertilizer, which have to be produced elsewhere, and you want something that can sustain itself. And also, you need a way to process human and animal waste and the inedible parts of food. And so it turns out we have an energy efficient system that works on Earth, is the soil, and mainly the microbes that are in the soil and the marshes. They capture toxic trace compounds and recycle a lot of things. And of course, they did what you call integrated pest management. No pesticides, so you do crop rotation and you bring in beneficial insects and so on. They did build a test module first, 1/400th scale, testing out all the major systems. It looked like this. You can get a feel for it. They typically had a lot of plants. This was a human habitat. They could keep one person in here, and the longest closure they did there was about 5 weeks. But they proved out all the things they needed to for the real biosphere too. So the real story was taking place in what they called missions 1 and 2. The first mission was the one that lasted 2 years, and it did have its share of controversies, but I think you can say that it was completed and a lot was learned. There were a lot of politics going on, and the second mission really kind of failed. It was a political problem, essentially chaos. So the focus here is what did we learn, which is mostly what we learned in mission 1. CO2, of course, is a big issue. Now back then, this was a while ago, Earth CO2 levels are about 350 parts per million. Actually, they're up to 400 right now. And just for reference, their CO2 levels on the space shuttle are about 5,000 ppm parts per million. And it's considered truly unhealthy for people at about 10,000 ppm. So, you know, there's a big question is, well, what are you going to get when you're in a closed area? Well, in Biosphere 2, they found that in summer, when they had a lot of daylight hours, a lot of photosynthesis going on, they were running at about 1,000 parts per million. And in the winter, it would creep up to 5,000. There's the graph here showing over the 2 years, the winter and summer peaks. Several other things that are a little different than Earth. Each day, just day to night fluctuations are about 600 parts per million. That's huge compared to Earth, but that's basically due to the fact there's just a whole lot more biomass per amount of atmosphere. So it's the effect of day versus night when you have photosynthesis occurring and when you don't have it occurring. The plants actually respire. They actually give off CO2 at night. And so you get a huge variation, twice, 2 orders of magnitude more than the Earth. So CO2 management was a big deal. How did they do that? Well, they lowered the temperatures at night to reduce the plant respiration when they're actually giving off CO2. Avoid composting during the low light season. They actually literally did carbon sequestration by cutting and storing the biomass. That sort of thing. That the CO2 scrubber was used in the winters. So it had about 100 parts per million effect. You could consider it successful, I think, but it did take a lot of work. They had to work at it. It was actually unusually overcast for those 2 winters too, which made it even worse. One thing that nobody expected was the oxygen concentration. They weren't even worried about that when they went into this thing. But you know, starting with around 20-21% like we have in the atmosphere, we had a gradual decline. Finally, you know, 3/4 of the way through their project, they said enough is enough, and they actually brought in about 31,000 pounds of liquid oxygen to get it back up. So what happened? What went wrong there? Well, it was kind of a combination of things. You could say there was some things they just hadn't thought about, and maybe some design mistakes. They basically they brought in a lot of really rich soil, which meant a lot of organics, and then of course you had a lot of microbes that were going after that. So that used up a lot of oxygen. That consumed it. Now they generate CO2, but that wasn't all absorbed by the plants. What happened is it got absorbed as calcium carbonate. So CO2 wasn't really the main problem here. It was just a lack of oxygen. They actually found that they could just coat the concrete in the second mission, and they solved that problem. So this is kind of a reminder of what happens on Earth, where where is all the carbon and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? That's a relatively small part of where all the carbon is. Most of it's in the rock, and it turned out same thing happened here. You got to consider biology. Biology is not really independent of geology. As for agriculture results, we found they didn't manage to be completely self-sufficient. They only grew 81% of the food they needed in mission 1. So the rest of it was taken from seed stock, and some they had in there prior to closure. The other thing is they were living on essentially a starvation diet. You might call it subsistence agriculture. Now there's some reasons for this. One is they only relied on natural light. They had some kind of an ideological bias about not having artificial light, which I think was probably short-sighted. When you think about going to other places like Mars, you're not going to have that much light, and you're going to be living underground to avoid the radiation anyway. So you're going to have artificial light. So that was probably an artificial constraint they had in there. In fact, they figured this out by mission 2, and during the period when it did run, they actually did achieve 100%, mainly by adding artificial light. They did find that the pigs and the chickens just ate too much, so they got eaten instead. Their diet was very dense, low-calorie diet. That was actually something. There's a doctor named Dr. Roy Walford out of UCLA who actually published books about this and did a lot of studies and claimed that low-calorie diets were the way to go to avoid aging and everything. Anyway, well, he got to prove it. He was one of the biospherians, people living in there. They tracked everybody's body weight, and everybody lost about 16% of their body weight the first year, but they did stabilize and recover during the second year. Overall, their health was in fact good, and they had improved cholesterol and blood pressure. The system did supply everything needed except vitamin D. The species packing was pretty much as expected. In the case of the rainforest, they lost, well, they lost about 40% of the species, but they kept 61%. They did prove that things do, self-organization did occur. So you had explosions of some creatures and less of others. It did require manual intervention by people quite a bit. So time is too short to see how the cycles play out. Humans did have to play a role. But you could say that in general, they did prove the feasibility of a sustainable biosphere, more or less. There were notable problems like the O2, but those were explained and are preventable. But the important thing is the people came out alive and healthy after 2 years of being completely isolated from the Earth's atmosphere. That was not a given. Most people didn't think it'd last 100 days. Second thing is that their harmful compounds were removed. There was no toxic buildup of anything. They tracked a lot of things besides CO2. They were tracking nitrous oxides, hydrogen sulfide, ethylene, CO, all kinds of things. The only thing that didn't actually get decomposed by the cell bed reactors was the nitrous oxide. Normally that's decomposed by radiation in the stratosphere on Earth. They were able to track and do a lot of modeling of closed loop cycles, which are very accelerated because of the small volume of this thing. And of course, that's a reminder that small closed systems like this are very vulnerable. How do they spend their time?
Excuse me, you have a 3-minute warning, Greg.
Okay. I'm just about to wrap it. Okay, so 25% of the time is spent on agriculture. That's the one problem with being farmers in space. You do have to be a farmer in space. The last topic was just the group dynamics. External relationships suffered, as you'd expect. The internal relationships got pretty severe. There were 2 groups they split into. They were barely on speaking terms. Really, that reflected battles that were kind of ideological battles going on outside as well, and they just reflected that. And that was made worse by the fact that there was at such low O2 levels, they were living basically up on the top of the Himalayas, and they were pretty fatigued as a result. But the interesting thing is, even though they weren't speaking to each other very much, they still managed to work as a team to achieve their goals. Actually, 2 of them got married right after exiting. I think that actually concludes it. That's the end of the formal presentation. So questions, comments?
That was outstanding, Greg. What a fascinating opportunity. Let's see. I don't see any questions in chat just yet. So let me probably ask you a question that's a little bit off the wall. Okay. One of the areas that folks are talking about Earth and Earth type worlds and biospheres is in a little different area. It's not necessarily a focus on settlements and off-world settling, even though that is going on, but dialogue around exoplanets. So the conversation on exoplanets, of course, is that if you're looking for near Earth, you want to establish what the parameters are that somewhat define Earth so that you can focus phenomenology in order to pick up certain signatures. So the biosignatures that are indicators of life or a focus of technology for observatory development and instrumentation. Are there any parameters that perhaps might have been collected during the biosphere experiment that give you a feel for acceptable tolerances that might inform some of the exoplanet research?
Well, I guess the thing to point out is, of course, this was totally based on Earth-based life, so, and in fact, it really kind of assumed gravity for most of the technology they were using. So it may not help in the upper atmospheres of Venus or something, but I'm not sure it pointed to detecting signs of life that are based on other biologies, because they were so focused on how do we reproduce Earth, how do we make ourselves live. It was they weren't really worrying about the exobiology kinds of things, if that's what you're getting at. I mean, they'd identified the chemical markers. I mean, and those are pretty well known. I mean, even going back to early studies by Hansen and people pointing out that, obviously if you have oxygen in the atmosphere in any significant amount, you probably have some kind of life going on, because that's, oxygen will not stay in the atmosphere. It's too reactive. And the same goes for a lot of the other compounds that are products of life. They don't tend to last unless they're being continually regenerated. So, but those were all pretty well known. I mean, even back in the time when this thing was going on. So I'm not sure if that answers.
No, it did. So I was really wondering if there was some data that you picked up on decay or performance that we were surprised to see. But you answered the question. Thank you.
Okay.
So thanks very much for your presentation. Again, it sounds like it was an extremely challenging but rewarding experience, and definitely something that I'm sure we'll probably have to repeat in the very near future. So thank you.
Let's hope that we don't have to do this in 10 years and saying, well, 40 years ago, there was this great experiment.
Good point. Again, thank you.
Thank you.